All right, folks. Well, welcome to the quick draft, deep focus, and we're really going to be talking about the 4-hour article method broadly. But to do that, we're going to also be talking about writing at speed and what does that mean. So welcome, and we've got a lot that we're going to move through, actually, and pretty quickly, perhaps at speed. For those of you who haven't attended CSU Writes offerings before, just know that we are a program, again, supporting professional kind of research and scholarly writers, but it's because we build ideas, innovations, careers, and our communities ultimately by writing. We recognize that, and that we know that our work changes the world because it's published, that it's funded, and it's cited. So it's not just that we want to be writing, it's that we actually want to be writing impactful work. And so that's one of the other things that CSU Writes helps you do, is focus on that kind of meaningful work. We also facilitate, excellent writing engagement, development, and contribution across diverse disciplines and research communities. You got to see in the chat. And if you're just arriving, please introduce yourself in the chat. See all the different disciplines and different projects that folks are working on during the time that they're part of CSU Writes. We run across the career span, so we have threads for graduate students, grad writes, doc for postdocs, faculty writes for faculty, and team writes for collaborative writers. And we're funded through the graduate school and the vice president for research. So our time together, these are the things that we're going to move through. And I'm telling you so that you can kind of prepare your mind for holding on to the information that's most important for you, the things that you want to know, that you want to take with you. And it helps to prepare your mind. And we'll talk a little bit about that also when we talk about preparing your writing projects and preparing for your writing sessions to be able to make the most of those. So I'll ask you in a couple minutes to share in the chat, but what is writing at speed? What does write at speed mean to you? So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, that we'll do a share out there. And then, welcome, Daniel. Good to have you. We want to talk about what or even who, because I think we internalize a lot of voices, or we have a lot of external distractions that kind of get in our way of being able to write at speed at times. And so let's think about what that is. We're going to talk a lot about separating generative writing from editing. And if you can do that, if you can master that, you will experience flow. And we'll talk about what that means. Dealing with inner critics. We often have to do that. I don't think I've ever talked to a writer who didn't have some sort of internal critic or critical voice that would speak to them either in ways that's supportive for their writing project or could be detrimental to their kind of sense of who they are as a writer. And so we'll talk about those in terms of daemons, and those are the kind of like ancient, they come from ancient Greece. These are not new concepts. Writers have been haunted for the centuries, right? But those are the kind of internalized voices that slow or stall our progress. But there's also distractions, and distractions can be internal and external. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about some clear methods on how it is that you can practice disengaging generative writing from your editing. So I'll give you some just techniques, but also then some methods that you can apply and work through. We'll talk about a 5x5 or a 10x10, the Roosevelt dash, and then the 4-hour article method, which is one that this workshop then connects to. So for those of you who are writing an article or are writing a chapter of your dissertation, this method can work really great for that. And then we'll talk about the preparation for writing at speed, because if it's just like going out and sprinting, right? The Olympics, the sprinters in the Olympics make it look so easy, but whether you're swimming or whether you're on a track, it's tricky. It's a lot of work, a lot of preparation, and if you're not warmed up, if you're not ready to run that race, you can become injured. And so I think that there's a way we can take that analogy and apply it to writing as well. Maybe not injury in the same kind of way of like pulling a muscle, but it may be that you leave that writing session so disheartened, or I don't know, feelings of despair or whatever, that you actually you put it off. You stop writing for a while. And that's its own kind of form of injury that I think we can take care of with a little bit more just preparation and knowing what it takes to get into the writing sessions well. And the last thing I'll talk about are some resources through CSU Writes that we have. This is connected to Show Up and Write. we will have Sprint and Write on Tuesday mornings. And so that will make a lot more sense to you after I talk about generative writing and our write at speed techniques. This I attached to the Outlook meeting invite, but I can also attach it here in our chat. And I just want to make sure that you have access to a handout and information that is narrative and describes and also gives some attributions to where some of the things that we're talking about today are coming from. And so let me pop that into the chat so you have that there, but you can also access it if you lose the chat or lose your PDF from this session. It'll be in the Outlook meeting invite. All right, so as I asked or told you I was going to ask you before, just consider, what does write at speed mean to you? When I say write at speed, what are you thinking? Go ahead and pop it in the chat. As quickly as possible. I like the as possible part to that. Brain vomit onto paper. Yes, I think I'm going to steal that term and add it to the slides. Brain vomit. I love it. Just write without overthinking. Yep, absolutely love it. Not worrying about grammar or spelling. Love it. Write something in a short amount of time. Write words, not delete them. Yes, we will talk about that as well. Those are all great. Writing at speed. What else? Feel free to, if something else has applied to you or you're thinking, when I think about write at speed, this is what I'm really wanting or thinking about. Go ahead and keep those flowing. Writing without your inner editor taking over. Yes, yeah. Be in the zone. Writing everything that comes to mind. Yeah, that kind of smoothness, right? It just comes to you and that you're able to kind of gather and kind of put it out there. Absolutely. Awesome. I love it. And what I love about so many of your responses to writing at speed and that their approach, you're talking about the process. A lot of you are talking about like just how it is that you're moving through kind of the construction and kind of building out of those documents, the texts that we work with. Awesome. Some people think about it means that you finished lots of documents quickly, right? That you're producing at a great pace, which on the one hand, that can be the impact or the kind of outcome of writing at speed. But if you focus a lot on the end product before you're there at the end product stage, it can be a little overwhelming, right? It can stymie you in the moment. So good definitions. Great work, everybody. All right, I want to talk a little bit, or you just share with you Muybridge's photo from 1878, and this comes from archives where this is some of the first stop action photography in the US. And Edward Muybridge was a photographer who was hired by Stanford of Stanford Oil to help him win a bet. And the bet had been that a horse's hooves do leave the ground when they're at a gallop. And up to that point, because we didn't have film, right? We didn't have any proof. All we had was the human eye trying to look at a horse at a gallop and be able to see as quickly as those four, hooves were moving to see if they actually left the ground. And some people said they did, and some people said they didn't, that you actually always had one hoof that was always on the ground. And so what Muybridge did was he set up a series of cameras and along a track, and he had it so that as the horse ran by, the horse would trigger the next photo, right? The camera, and then they had visual proof at that point of a horse's hooves really leaving the ground when they're at a gallop. Oops. And so what that looks like is right here, you can see where it is that the horse is airborne. And I really like this metaphor for what it's like when we're writing at speed, when we're able to kind of just get those words flowing, the brain vomit that we're talking about, right? That feeling, it feels good. I think there's something of soaring. It's a little bit like being a bird, right? But still having all the materiality and the inability to fly unless you're at a gallop. And so this is something for us to keep in our minds of what it's like to be able to write with great pleasure, with great speed, and think about our hooves leaving the ground. I'm not the person who came up with the write at a gallop metaphor. That comes from Virginia Woolf. And so I'll talk about some other metaphors and ways that we can think about writing at speed, just so that you can know, am I writing at speed? Am I really kind of generatively writing in a way that feels pleasurable? Or should I kind of step back and kind of tweak and work on my practice just a little bit to be able to fine tune and get up to a gallop? Patricia Goodson, she's a professor of health education at Texas A&M, and she wrote a book called Practice or Becoming a Productive Academic Writer. This exercise, and it's also in the handout, I pull it from her book. It's 50 exercises for academic writers. It's a great book. She reminds us that generating a written text requires creativity and involves activating a specific mechanism in our brains. Editing text, on the other hand, is an analytical and repetitive action requiring attention to detail. Many people complain of writer's block because they attempt to generate and edit at the same time. So that's just something for us to keep in mind. Again, if you think that you're doing both, if you're doing both generative writing and editing at the same time, and that's been your habit, that's just been your way, just consider that you're shifting back and forth, and it might actually make your writing sessions a little bit more exhausting because you're not focusing on one way. And so just having a couple techniques to be able to smooth it out might make it so that you leave your writing sessions a little less tired and you're actually able to produce more over time more smoothly. Ultimately, what you want to do is you want to be able to separate your generating and editing of the text that you're creating through time, right? So generating at one time, editing at another time, but you can also do it through space. So if space works for you, if you can generate in one place and edit in another place, it can actually cue your mind that you are generating. This is my time to generate because I'm here at my generation space at my desk. And then later on, I'm going to be editing and I'm in my editing chair. And I pull this idea from a scholar who was at Rutgers University who wrote a book called The Clockwork Muse, where we show up with the muse, where we get excited about writing based on our having regularly scheduled writing sessions. And so Evitar Zerubbabel was his name, and he was a sociologist of time there. He's since retired, but he was incredibly prolific. And he had a desk that he wrote at in the morning. And then he'd take everything that he generated, he'd put it in a file folder. And then in the afternoon, he would pull something that he had generated days or even weeks beforehand, and he would edit in his chair. He had a system for being able to, by the way, to keep track of notes and things that came to him that he was like, oh, I want to edit this or I want to change that. So he would make notes on the draft and say, I know these things are going to change. Or let's say he was driving down the street and something came to him and he's like, oh, that's going to totally rework this section. He would go and he would add those notes to those drafts so that when he got to his editing stage, he would be well prepared for the editing stage. So we're primarily going to be talking about being prepared for your drafting stage. What can you do? What are some of those techniques? But just keep in mind that it's really helpful if you go back to edit after a sufficient amount of time so you can see your manuscript anew, that you have some notes or some ideas of how it is that you're going to edit that section. So just a couple key ways to think using time and space. Super simple, but really, really helpful for keeping them separate. So that generative writing, that being able to write at a gallop, it's called many different things. And so Daniel, this is where I'm thinking about your brain vomit, right? Patricia Goodson talks about it as a brain dump. Robert Boyce and Peter Elbow, they talk about it as spontaneous writing, where it's just, and you can think about that, right? It's spontaneous, you can feel it. Writing at a gallop, we've already talked about from Virginia Woolf. Someone mentioned feelings of flow earlier. Yeah, it can feel like that flow. So Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is the scholar who's well known for having studied flow and talk about how we get into those flow states. It's kind of our optimal performance place. But interestingly enough, and this is the downside of generative writing and brain dumping and, word vomiting or vomiting is that it's messy. The logic that we often use when we are writing quickly is an associative logic, and it may not be a causal logic, and it may not actually be connected clearly with some of the logics that are at play in the conversations that are going on in your field about that topic. And so when you go back and you're doing editing, you're bringing in more of the literature review or other things, you might find that you're like, yeah, I kind of got the parts and pieces, but the logic here, I'm going to have to kind of rework and kind of explain how things are fitting together. It's creative in that sense that it's creating something that is new. We often, in academic writing or in the sciences, think about creativity as being the purview of the liberal arts, and that is so not the case. In this instance, creativity really happens through your academic writing. So you are creating something that didn't exist before, right? So that's important for you to think about. And then it's productive, right? You get a lot. You may wind up with double or more of the words that you actually need for a manuscript if you're generating, in part because creating clarity and concision is not part of the generative writing process for as much as we would want it to. And gradually over time, what may happen is that when you really are familiar with your topic, when you really are steeped in what it is that you're writing about, when you feel pretty comfortable about sitting down and kind of generating a draft, you'll find a pace and you'll find that kind of a way with your language and sentence construction that you will probably have less editing that you'll have to do on the back end over time. So you will probably generate at a maybe a slightly slower pace, but a good pace for you that also allows for you to have less editing to do later on. But it really is how clear are you in your topic, how knowledgeable are you with that, and how comfortable do you feel in that moment expressing that. So editing and revision is a little different. It's more like being kind of like this art critic over here, where you're kind of looking at the fine details, you're looking at your sentences, you're looking at the arrangement, and you're taking things a little bit more slowly. You're spending some time with that manuscript. You're tidying things up. You're looking for some clarity, right? You're going to see what it is that can be clearly expressed and how concisely can it be expressed. Clarity and concision are the two prized qualities of academic writing. If you talk to your faculty advisors, yes, they want the content there, but after that, they're going to want it to be clear and concise. And that is the very same thing with journal editors. They did a poll a number of years ago, probably about 15 years ago, and journal editors across the board said the top two qualities they were looking for in manuscripts was clarity and concision. Because they want, if you think about it, efficiency in reading, and they want people to come back and they want them to read in their journals. And if things are not clear and they are wordy and excessive, then it means that you're first of all, that manuscript is less likely to be cited, less likely to be promoted. So you think about that as in terms of like the work that you're producing, clarity and concision, it happens on the editing and revision side, which means that this process is being thoughtful. It's actually being critical, but critical in a way that is geared towards the text. You can see the art critic, right, looking at the painting. This is a criticism that is geared not towards you as the writer at all, but geared towards the text. What are you seeing on the page? How can it be reshaped? What's going to be better for the reader in reading that manuscript? Maybe connecting ideas that were disconnected before, organizing and rearranging things, as I mentioned. But when that critical eye, if it turns towards you as the writer in that moment of editing, or even just in writing in general, if you have a critical lens that is geared towards writing the best possible, whatever it is you're writing, right? It could be a master's thesis. It could be a chapter of your dissertation. It could be an article for publication that's then going to become a chapter of your dissertation. It could be an abstract, whatever the thing is that you're writing. If you go from focusing on the qualities of an abstract and the material or information that you want to be sharing or putting into that abstract, and you turn it towards you as a writer, and that critical lens goes to critiquing who you are. Who are you to say these things? Why would you think that? Do you really know? Like all those things that happen in writing sessions, right? It's just a moment. If you're kind of haunted by those demons and those voices, it's a moment for you to kind of check it, be aware of it, and we'll talk about strategies in a moment, but to just check it and go, okay, I need to retool, I need to focus on the text and not on me. Because the mental gymnastics that you have to go through in order to go back and forth with that shifted the lens in your mind, right? So focus on the text and figure out like, what do I need to change here versus focusing on me, and am I really good enough to be able to produce this, blah, 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 all the things that happen, right? In that move, that's exhausting. It makes writing so hard and so tiring. And so if that's part of your kind of regular operating procedures, what I would recommend is that you just be aware of it and catch it, and then kind of shift your focus back to the text. Take a breath, just focus on the text. So dealing with those inner critics and distractions, here are some strategies. So if you're haunted, just pause for a moment and then consider, what kind of character or voice does this inner critic have? Is it trying to be helpful? Does it seem to be debilitating or demoralizing? Is it your advisor's voice? By the way, I still hear my advisor's voice, both written on the page. I can see her handwriting, but I can also hear her voice in my head as I'm writing sometimes. And there are sentences that I write to this day where I'm like, oh, wow, that sounds like Judith Ruth. She was my kind of coming into the world as a scholar. She was such a great guide, and I can still hear her voice. So for the most part, that voice is helpful for me in shaping what it is that I'm trying to say. Is it insightful? Sometimes, yeah. But if you have advisors who are that advisor's voice in your mind or head, which is condescending or energy sucking, sometimes paternalistic or grandmotherly, right? If it borders on kind of something that takes away your own agency and being able to write in the moment, just mark that, just know. And then you also get in touch with, okay, so why is that the voice that's coming forward now? There's a wonderful play about writing a Broadway play, and there's a song, you can look it up on YouTube, a song called Die, Vampire, Die. And they talk about all the inner demons, all the vampires that come forward and trying to write this play. And one of them is a grandmotherly voice where they talk about how the grandmother wants to spray air freshener and make the person write only about kittens, because wouldn't that be nice, right? That kind of grandmotherly voice. But if you think about academic writing and what you need to be doing, that's not the voice that you probably want to be listening to. You need to be listening probably to an advisor or a mentor, somebody in the field, other voices that would be more supportive and aligned with what it is that you're writing. Question whether you can distinguish between a voice, internalized voice that is helpful for your editing perspective, or if it's paralyzing. And it takes some work. If you have been repeatedly traumatized, I'll use that term, either in the margins or verbally by someone who was coaching you or working with you as a writer before. It happens all the time. By the way, it happens a lot in sending manuscripts out and having that peer review done. And there's a huge joke about peer reviewer number 2, right? Peer reviewer number 2, why are they always so mean? Peer reviewer 2, why do they always have these little kind of idiosyncratic kind of gripes about the manuscript? Reviewer number 2, right? So if it's reviewer number 2, just kind of put it on hold and say, okay, reviewer number 2 might actually have something helpful to say that might at some point in time be insightful for me changing this manuscript. But if I'm going to internalize this now, it might paralyze me. I always share the fact that one of my colleagues in College of Natural Resources submitted a paper at one point and got the comment back. It was for a journal that was a stretch journal for her, but she got the article back, and one of the reviewers said, this reads like it was written by a wildlife biologist in this kind of condescending way. And her thought was, I am a wildlife biologist, as if so even when they're name calling, right? Even when they're calling you a wildlife biologist, just know that you have an opportunity to pause and kind of consider and then redirect. Virginia Woolf, I mentioned her write at a gallop, what she talked, and the reason why she came up with the notion of writing at a gallop was for her to outpace the editors in her head. So she was a prolific writer. In order to be able to write criticism at a time when women did not write criticism, she said that she had to come up with systems and methods for her to be able to just write it out, so that she knew that she would be judged as a woman, that this was uncommon and unacceptable in some ways. And so how would she deal with the part of her that internalize that notion of unacceptable, right? So at one point she writes about killing the angel in the house, so that she could be free enough to write what she needed to write. In her novel Orlando, she calls that editor Nick Green, right? This internalized voice of editors. You can also practice RAIN. I think this is a wonderful technique. It comes out of mindfulness and kind of meditation practices, but it is a system, a structure for you to follow where you can then kind of catch yourself and be able to note and identify what those voices are. So the first thing that you can do is recognize in the moment. So that's the R. So recognize that this is what's going on, that you are somehow having, you've turned that inner critic towards you and who you are, what you know, what you're going to be putting on the page. And then you just become in that awareness, you kind of allow it. And so you avoid avoidance, meaning that you just allow yourself to kind of get comfortable in knowing that, yes, this is how, that inner critic works, or how you feel when that inner critic strikes. And then just investigate it, get curious about, like, what does that feel like? Why is that critic there? Some of the things that we talked about on the previous slide or information, that's kind of that investigation, that being curious about who's the inner critic that's helping guide you or not guiding you. And then just note, and that identifying and labeling, super, super helpful to know. Is that the voice of your mentor? Is that the voice of your mother? Is that the voice of, some reader number 2, right? Where are you getting that from? And is that helpful or is it not? It allows for you to take control in some ways in processes where we feel like we might not have a lot of control about how readers respond in the moment and when we're writing. All right. So let's talk about some methods for drafting quickly. We'll draw on some of these techniques and I'll bring them in we can, but let's see. Move forward. There we go. So limiting project distractions. Heard about that in the chat already. A little bit of conversation about being able to focus, focus deeply, get in the flow. Writing distractions happen both internally and externally. I have come to understand that external distractions may be easier for us to control, interestingly enough, than the internal ones. That you can pick the place where you're going to go and write. You can control it through space. You can, if you are just, if you have a noisy grad lounge and you're trying to write in there and it's not working for you, you can change up your space and you can go someplace where it's quieter. That's an easier fix than maybe the internal distractions, which are how many other things you have on your plate, the pressures to be able to grade whatever, those essays that have just come in from students, the pressures of email for sure, getting back to, the lab, whatever the things are that are the internal distractions. Being able to set those aside for the designated time that you have for writing can be really, really helpful. If you are a highly distracted or distractible writer, for me, I will confess that I have a lot going on in my head all the time and I kind of ping pong around. And Kimmy will tell you, she will testify that I am an associative thinker. My partner, who loves me deeply, after our very first conversation, he's like, wow, you really are abstract random. That if you have a lot going on in your head and it's not always clear and sorted out, it's great to have some practices, some breathing techniques or other things where you can clarify and get focused. For me, time is essential as well. And we'll talk about the reasons why we use time to condense our writing sessions and make sure that we're focused during those times. Because if you allow yourself to repeatedly just wander around in your mind or go down rabbit holes while you're trying to generate or write something out, that will become your process and your practice. And you'll just want to be aware if that's what you do. If it works for you, keep it. But if it's something that you get done with writing sessions and you're like, wow, how did I get so little accomplished? That's a sign that you want to have some better strategies during your writing session to perhaps limit those distractions, whether external or internal. And by the way, if you have strategies and you want to share them out, if there are things that are working for you, please pop those in the chat, because these are not the only strategies, not the only ways of dealing with internal or external distractions. So please, if we learn from one another, or you can share it out and when we regroup at the end. All right, so creating that distraction-free kind of writing session. I think about it in terms of here as a session, in terms of time, rather than just as a place. So you're thinking about scheduling sessions, making sure that you have them on your calendar, that you're showing up, and that you know that going to that session is going to allow for you to be able to focus, and that you're going to be able to, perhaps, depending on what it is that you're doing that day, focus with some sort of intensity. If you are generating, you're going to want to have the intensity come from being able to be saturated with a lot of information or quotations or key ideas and things that you're going to be explaining. Maybe you want to be writing out your method section, a draft of your method section. So you want to be able to be clear on what did you do, and so you'll refresh on those notes and those lab notes to be able to get focused and be able to have an intense writing session. Yes, and writing your methods, right? And just generating that out. Then thinking about managing those internal and external interruptions and those attention diverting forces. If you know that you have a propensity for being distracted by certain things, and you can just make a list. What are the things that distract you typically? How do you get derailed in your writing sessions? You know you better than anybody else. So what are the things that derail you? And then next to it, can you put some things that you know will be able to support and keep you from getting derailed? It could be either being better prepared for your writing session, getting clear on what it is that you're working on during that session, having a designated section to work on, or having an option of 2 or 3 designated sections that you would be able to write on, depending on how you feel in that moment, if you need to have some variety. So what are the things that you're going to do that could manage your internal and then, of course, your external distractions? This comes from Cal Newport's Deep Work. I'll reference him again for the Roosevelt technique. But in his deep work sessions, he says that there's no email breaks, no daydreaming, no Facebook browsing, and no repeated trips to the coffee machine. So if you find that you are, perhaps like me, getting up and repeatedly making many cups of tea during a session, it could be a sign for you to just stop and pause for a moment, figure out, why do I keep getting up and going and getting more tea? Because chances are it's not that I'm lacking hydration and I don't really need another cup of tea sometimes, right? So if I have my cup of tea and I'm cruising through, oftentimes that tea will get cold. And I know that I've had a good writing session when I haven't been able to finish my cup of tea. But if I'm up and back and forth and I'm distracted, there's usually a couple reasons, key reasons why. More often than not, it means that I'm either nervous about writing that section for whatever reason those crop up, or that I don't feel prepared for writing that section. Happens to all of us. All right, so let's talk about some of the techniques and things that you can do. This one is that first one that's on your writing handout. It is from Patricia Goodson's, How to Be a Productive Academic Writer, 50 exercises. And so this is one of her exercises. She doesn't call it the 5x5 practice. She calls it the write quickly and edit slowly exercise. But I like it because it's 5 minutes on, 5 minutes on generating and 5 minutes on editing. And so I like, it's just, if we can shorten it to the 5x5, I think it's a little easier. And I think you can start, by the way, writing sessions. And I've had folks who have tried this out and it really, really does work. If you are someone who chronically combines your generative writing and your editing, and it slows you down and bunges you up, you can start your next, we could say for 2 weeks, I'm going to start all of my writing sessions with a 5x5 practice. I'm going to generate without critique or pause. Someone earlier mentioned not using the backspace, right? Not deleting. That's perfect, right? That's what you do. Just keep moving forward, keep the text going. Even if you get stuck, you're like, don't know what I was going to say here, but I think it was going to be blah. And usually by the time you get done typing that or writing that, you're on to what it is that you were going to say next. So your brain just needed to have just a moment to kind of collect itself, and you can just keep going, because you can edit all of the other stuff out. You can edit whatever it is that you're musing about or whatever that's not really working, you can edit out later. So that 5 minutes of generating, and then you can just take a minute, take a moment to catch your breath. That's when you might go make a cup of tea, right? Then come back and then you edit it. You could even try out the different spaces, right? Generating in one space, one chair, editing in another chair to kind of reorient your mind. And then through that editing, you then review, you add new material, you rearrange things. You cull, meaning you delete out what's unnecessary. And I have add and add twice, so maybe I should have edited and culled that. That's called perhaps irony. But in that editing phase, that's when you shape the writing to be what it is that you want. And we'll talk more about that in a bit as well. But that shaping process, that's what readers will get from you. They're not going to get all your generated drivel, you know, kind of all of your brain dump or your word vomit or your brain vomit, right? That's not what people want to read, first of all, and you don't want them to be reading that. And so when we combine both of them, it's usually because we're pressed to deadline or it's just become our practice or a habitual way of writing. And it means that you also are not trusting that by generating content, you're then going to be able to have time to come back and revise it. So if you are a last minute or binge writer, chances are you're also then combining both your generating and your editing practice. And if you can separate them out just a little bit, say, all right, I'm going to generate and I'm going to just crank out a whole bunch of junk the day before, and then I'll go through and I'll edit it the day after and just see how that works. What I like about the 5x5 practice, though, is you can do it in 10 minutes-ish before a writing session or at the start of a writing session. And what it does is it trains your brain to understand the difference between this is what it's like to generate without editing. This is what it's like to go back and edit and clean things up. And you can kind of get a sense of like what's pleasurable in both of those practices. Also, it helps you kind of understand in the body, what does it feel to write quickly versus what does it mean to edit slowly and go through and just kind of pull through. And then you can't fully generate without trusting that you're going to be able to go back and edit. So they go hand in hand. If you want to sit down and again, thinking about time constraints and you've waited to the last minute to crank something out, if you are under a deadline pressure, you're more apt to combine those in part because you don't feel like the time that's allotted to you will allow for you to separate them out. So you're not trusting that whatever it is that you write, you're going to have time to go back and revise. So by practicing this, not just for a couple days, but I would say recommend for a couple weeks, try it out for a few days, at least over a period of time. You can then get a sense of like, how do I extend that in my writing sessions? How would I generate for 20 minutes, have that be enough writing for me then to go back and revise and edit later on in the afternoon or something along those lines. It's hard to generate, I think, at speed, by the way, for more than 25 minutes at a time. I think once you start to tip into over half an hour, most people get exhausted. And so you want to be able to take breaks. And we'll talk about strategies where you can build these together and what that looks like with the 4-hour article draft. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Cal Newport's deep work again and what that's like when you create distraction-free spaces to do a deep work task, which is a high priority task. If your writing is not considered yet high priority, you elevate it to the place where it is, because that's how we continually knock it off of our schedule. We're like, oh yeah, this isn't really important. Oh yeah, this isn't. But it needs to be high priority. And so make sure that you set aside that time for a deep work task. And whatever that time is that your schedule allows, and how often that happens during a week is really up to you and your schedule. You want to make sure that you have enough time to be able to draft out what it is that you're working on or creating during that week, but you don't want to have so much time that you're kind of meandering. So most people set up, writing sessions for anywhere between half an hour to 2 hours. And if you're writing anywhere between 3 to 6, sometimes 7 days a week, that's good. So you could have 3 2-hour sessions during a week and be highly, highly productive, by the way. You could have, sometimes people do it with 2-hour, but if you have 2 half-hour sessions, that's probably not enough for you to feel like you're actually making any progress or for you to keep track. So in setting those kind of times and prioritizing your deep work tasks, you want to be able to just make sure that you know what your schedule is and prioritize it there. Estimate how long this is going to take. How long do you think it'll take to draft out your introduction, to draft out 2 paragraphs, to draft out the method section, whatever it is that you're working on. So how long do you think it's going to take? And then Cal Newport recommends setting a deadline that will drastically reduce the time allotted. And this is when you start to get into the Roosevelt Dash. The Roosevelt Dash is something that he talks about in terms of Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt was a modestly good scholar, but he was really good at lots of other things. He was really good at dancing and boxing, and he was an ornithologist, and he wrote a book on birds his freshman year I think he was at Yale. So if you look up Birds of the Adirondack, that's Teddy Roosevelt. He wrote it as an undergraduate. It's a book, a pamphlet that's, you know, about the size of a scholarly article, but it was really well done. And those were his priorities, and notice that those priorities were not his classwork. Those priorities were not the courses that he was taking. So he had this system where he would drastically reduce the time that he worked on his schoolwork. And that's how he got all the other things done that he valued and that brought him meaning. So I think it's kind of funny that it wasn't his coursework. You set a time during that session for your drastically reduced time. So if you are going to draft out your method section and you think, okay, I know this is going to be 5 to 7 paragraphs. It's probably going to be about 2 to 3 pages. And I think that's going to take me to draft it out an hour and a half, right? Maybe an hour. What you do is you drastically reduce that time. You could take it from an hour and a half to an hour, push yourself right to see, can you get it done, draft it out in an hour? Or if you think it's going to take you an hour, kind of maybe half an hour would be really drastic, but, you know, cut it down to 45 minutes and set a timer for that. What that will do is it will force you to focus much more intensively than you might have done before. We tend to fill the spaces that we have. The same thing with time. If you allot 2 hours for doing that method section, it'll probably take you 2 hours. If you allot an hour and a half, it'll probably take you an hour and a half. So thinking about those tasks and what it is that you're going to be focusing on in your writing sessions, super helpful for being able to identify then with purpose, how much time is this going to take and how can I get myself to be able to focus and generate, and you'll have a happier writing session. It sounds like it could be pressure in this model as well. So if you're feeling pressure, that's not the point of it. And if you're feeling negative pressure, how's that? If you're feeling the pressure that kind of spurs you on and helps you kind of produce, and that you're not beating yourself up at the end if you don't make that, you know, if you don't meet the timer, right? If you're like, oh, it really did actually take me an hour. It just took you an hour, right? There's no reason to beat yourself up for it. So again, you want to keep those inner critics out of focusing on you and keep the critic focused on problem solving. How am I going to do this next time? Strategic thinking, right? Focused on your project kind of thoughts. And then work with great intensity to that buzzer. The goal is to beat the buzzer, according to Cal Newport. I have never, by the way, just want to confess, I've never beat the buzzer on a Roosevelt Dash, but I keep trying. This is not something that you would do every day. So if I'm recommending that you could practice the 5x5, that kind of write quickly and edit slowly kind of exercise from Patricia Goodson. Roosevelt Dashes you don't do every single day. This is something that you practice kind of and build your skills up to maybe once a week and then add days as you build strength. Cal Newport reminds us that after you do a really intensive session like this, you will be wrung out. You will be tired. It's one of the reasons why I think we often avoid kind of deep work tasks and heavy lifts in our writing is because just like any kind of exercise program where you know you're going to have an intense day at the gym, you might just kind of brace yourself for a moment and have to kind of take a deep breath and like, yep, just move out the door and not even think about it too much because you know you're going to be tired at the end. But just like that kind of workout, you're also going to need to have some recovery time. So we don't just follow up a heavy workout at the gym with another heavy workout at the gym. We give our bodies time to recuperate, right? Long run days are not followed by additional long run days. They're followed by rest days or a shorter run day. And so just thinking about like, what do you need in order to recover? So we talked a lot about awareness. And that's one of the things that you will also want to be aware of is how long does it take you to recover after an intensive writing session? Oh, and I see that the chat. Estimating how long it will take is hard. Yes, a lot of the time. And does that come with practice? It's such a great question. And I'm going to say yes. And then really it depends on who you are as a writer. And I will confess that, and this takes, I'm going to share a personal detail from second grade. In second grade, I was in the advanced math section. I was so happy and proud of myself. Until then, I got bumped down out and I got kicked out of advanced math because I couldn't estimate. And I kept wanting to count things. It's so weird, right? Like all those, I don't know, marbles in a jar, and you're supposed to estimate how many marbles are. And I literally couldn't do it. So estimation, it turns out, is not one of my skills. Knew it in elementary school, and it's still for me quite challenging. So when I look at, an amount of workload, or I look at what it's going to take to put something together, I am almost drastically off. And I could be way over, which sometimes happens, but more often than not, I'm kind of optimistic, and I'm kind of like a Labrador, and I'm like, oh, yeah, I can do that, and I can do that, and I can do that, and that's so great, and I get excited. And I have to watch for myself now. I have to watch when I get really excited, because that means that I'm probably not being very realistic with my time, or I'm being fantastical with my time. It's based on what I would want to have done. So, for example, I've been working on some data and in some spreadsheets for a project that I thought was going to take me, I estimated 3-4 days, and I'm now 2 weeks still working on it. So it's just, some of it's practice, and some of it is just kind of the nature and being able to know, do you have the flexibility to be able to kind of honor the way that you work? I know that's perhaps not the best answer, but for many of you who are not so estimatingly challenged, yes, you will get better with practice. So dashes, those dashes, what they do, according to Newport, and I think that this is spot on, or I wouldn't share it with you, but they leverage artificial deadlines to help you systematically increase the level that you can regularly achieve. So dashes are incompatible with distraction. So we go back and we're thinking about deep focus. If you are challenged, you have a difficult time focusing in your writing sessions, try out the Roosevelt dashes, because they routinely give you a place then where you have to hyper focus in order to be able to meet that buzzer, right? Or beat the buzzer. So it's a great way to be able to create external conditions that force your internal kind of conditions of your mind to limit those internal distractions as well. So something that we prototyped at CSU in 2021 and are still working with, we've done experiments, we have some data, we will continue to work with this because it's just a really kind of fun and useful workshop. We're not doing it specifically as a workshop in the same way that we have. This is an old flyer. I think this one is from last fall, but I just wanted to give you a sense of kind of what the breakdown and what it has looked like before. But the 4-hour article method came out of a conversation with me and a colleague from civil and environmental engineering. I had said, I attended the 2-hour job search talk, and I was like, I'm inspired. I'm like, can we draft an article in 2 hours? And she was like, well, I got a team. So she had a interinstitutional team that she was working with to draft out an article, and I had an article that summer that I was working on. So we set it up. We were like, all right, let's do a 2-hour article draft and see what happens. And it turns out we couldn't do it. Neither one of us could do it. I got about halfway-ish there, and that team also got about halfway-ish there. So what we did was we added on a second 2-hour session where we all prepared, we got, illustrations and data crunched and all those things that you need to have prepared in order to be able to generate content. You have to have, for that, the team, they had to have assigned sections, right? Who's writing on what section and how is that happening? And so it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to prepare, I think, for those sessions. It takes a while. So you can't just sit down and write an article in 4 hours if you're not fully prepared to be able to address the literature review, for example. If you don't have all of that somehow laid out with quotations and citations and know how it is that you're entering into those conversations, it's going to be well, impossible, I think, for you to draft out that literature review within a short period of time. It would be impossible, by the way, for you to draft out that literature review, even if you had all the time set aside during the day. You're like, yeah, I can have all day to write it. But if you don't already know who you're in conversation with, you're going to be spending most of your time going back and looking for sources, right? So the 4 to 6 weeks preparation is really crucial. Those are treated like writing sessions, right? For a couple hours, you're prepping that literature review, you're prepping all your data analysis, you're prepping kind of that, maybe outlining some of the sections so that you know exactly what it is that's going in there. And then we do the 2-hour timed writing sessions. So for those of you who are drafting maybe your thesis or drafting a chapter, drafting an article, this is a great structure for you. You can get anywhere, writers get anywhere between 1,500 and 3,000 to 5,000. 5,000 was the outlier for what it is that people were able to produce in basically 4 hours of 2-hour timed writing sessions. So how we've done it in the past is we have the introductory session in early September. Here we're talking about this at the end of August. And then there's drafting sessions in October. What we'll have is 2-hour sessions that start in September in a few weeks, and those will continue then through the semester. So you wouldn't have to jump into only those two. If those two don't work for you, you could jump into other ones later. So if this is something that you think will work for you, yeah, then that's great. I'll ask you to sign up, and we'll provide just some additional information now for you to kind of consider, like, what would it take for me to get prepared to do this? But as I'm talking about this is the advice that I'm giving for preparing to be able to do a 2-hour timed, kind of article writing sessions for the 4-hour article. That is preparation. These are preparation ideas that you can take with you and use for any number of projects. It doesn't have to just be for this. So this is what it looks like, by the way. I just want to have you take a breath and a moment. Those 2-hour sessions are intense. We start off and we would just have an early bird start where people would jump on to Zoom. These first ran them on Zoom only. They'll be hybrid this semester. And you just kind of get yourself organized and kind of ready to be able to write. And then we have a kind of welcome, just 5 minutes, super short and tidy. And then we do first 25-minute writing section, right? What's the first segment? What's your first lap that you're going to do? We wrap that and we do really quickly within 5 minutes. You wrap and you kind of, do you need to leave notes? Are you picking up that section the next time on the next go round? Then you probably don't need to leave many notes. But if you're putting it on hold and you're going to be coming back to it later, maybe next week, whatever, then you want to leave some notes for revision or what it is where you want to pick it up. And then bio breaks or whatever you need, kind of review and look for what you're going to be writing on for that next section of the article. Again, if you're continuing with the first one, that's not necessary. And then we do another 25-minute sprint. So through these 4 sprints and the wraps, we have, and you'll notice kind of like reminders and feedback and other things that can happen after the session. This is breathtaking, by the way, when you do the writing like this. The intensity it's very much like what Cal Newport was talking about with the Roosevelt dashes. By the time you leave these, you're tired. There's a lot of work that's gone into them. So preparing to write at speed, preparation is that part of writing. And that 4-hour article draft preparation, here's the key. You would identify the top journals, where it is that you're submitting. This is the reason for that is it gives you a sense of your audience and how you're going to shape whatever it is that you're writing. If you aren't clear, for example, if you're writing a thesis or a dissertation chapter and you're not clear about that format, I would go and find examples of what it is that you're writing so that you can prepare and you can kind of see what that is. And then just reverse outline them. Take a look. What do those models tell you? How long is it? What are the sections? What are the logical connections that happen between those sections? Readability. You shouldn't be asked to write anything that no one has ever written before, right? That's not terribly academic. That's usually, if it's arts and performance, somehow unique in that way that's never been done before. But we're all working with structures that are well-known genres and well-known structures. And so you should be able to kind of figure out, like, this is what an introduction looks like, and this is what a method section looks like, right? You should have data or anything that you're going to be writing on that you need to explain to someone else. You need to have that data analyzed. If you can, prepare your tables and figures and illustrations, part because that kind of builds out. And oftentimes, if you're in the sciences or engineering, and you're working with data and creating visual layouts and representations of that data, you want to be able to then explain it in words later on. So by creating those, you can actually also create the story that you're going to tell. And oftentimes you'll know first by creating your analyzing your data and then preparing your tables, then it'll help you identify what's the story that you're going to tell with this. And do you want to include that information? And sometimes you can look at it and it'll be kind of like that Sesame Street game where you have the quadrants and you have like 3 dogs and a basketball. And they're like, one of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong, right? You can take out the basketball, right? You can just take out something. And you're like, yeah, I thought I was going to work with that, but it doesn't seem to be working. You read all the relevant literature so that you know who you're in conversation with. You might have, depending on your discipline, you might have 60 to 100 plus articles listed as being people who have worked on certain things. But what you really can hold in your head are the main ideas and the distilled ideas. And so you might have one distilled idea, but like 10 folks who have written about it or whatever, however your field operates. But you need to have the relevant literature read, and you need to understand how your project is operating in relation to those other studies that have been done or those other arguments that have been made. Identify key quotations from the relevant literature. That can take some time, right? So again, thinking about that 4 to 6 weeks of preparation, you're working through that whole time. And through that 4 to 6 weeks, you're just really getting saturated and kind of pulling in everything that you want to be writing about later on. Identify what are the sections and subsections that you want to have them contain. So you could look at that then as a version of an outline. Identify what it is that you want to have in each article section. So what's going to go where. So that a version again of an outline. And I would recommend again practicing, what is that 5-minute on and 5-minute off for generating and then editing, generating and editing. What does that feel like? And how can you do it? And that builds that endurance. All right. In general, though, some good tips for focused and productive sessions are be prepared to write on whatever it is that you want to be showing up to write. And I know it sounds so simple. It is the obvious, it's stating the obvious. However, many of us show up to our writing sessions feeling the pressure to produce some sort of text, but without actually having done the preparation or kind of gathered what it is that we need to feel confident in the moment of our writing. So if you have that, again, that internal critic that turned towards you and says, who are you? And whatever, you're not smart enough to be writing this. You're not whatever those things might be with an internal critic, just pausing and being aware and kind of questioning. Your internal critic might actually just be telling you, you don't actually know enough right now about what you're talking about. It's not a judgment on who you are and your intelligence. It might just be that you don't really know or aren't feeling confident with what it is you have to write. That happens all the time, by the way. Many of us write ourselves into understanding. And so then it's having a conversation with your advisor, having a conversation with colleagues and saying, I'm taking a risk here. I'm taking a leap. I'm not quite sure if I really want to be writing these things or saying these things. And the only way that you'll know is by taking that risk and kind of generating it out and then taking a look at it later on. But it doesn't mean that you're not prepared to write on it. It means that you have really thought about that enough that you can go like, okay, I'm not exactly sure. I know a lot of this, and this is the leap I'm going to be making. And so that happens all the time in academic writing too. That's a form of preparation. If you want a focused and productive session, do not go down rabbit holes and just mark the impulse to go and find more information and then move forward. If you can batch it so that you are gathering information and gathering what you need at specific times, and that's separate from the time that you're working on it or writing, that's really, really helpful. If you are going down rabbit holes and you are meandering, it just suggests that you're not ready to be building out that full manuscript yet. You're still in the kind of like learning stage and kind of getting acquainted stage and trying to figure out how your project operates and works in the field kind of stage. And that's great. That's fine. You should be going down rabbit holes at that point in time. It can be really fun going through and looking at other articles and what other people have written about a topic that you really care about. And so that can be fun. That can be a great process. But it also means that you're probably not focusing then on the writing, you're focusing on the gathering, the reading, the mulling, the considering, right? And analyzing. And those are all perfect for writing sessions. We do all of those types of tasks in writing retreats. But if you're setting yourself up to produce something in a writing session that you say, okay, I want to have 3 or 5 pages drafted by the end of the session, and you find yourself that you've spent most of your time going through archives or, you know, like the databases or whatever, it suggests that you're just at a different stage than you thought you were. So if you're producing and you're doing generative writing during a writing session, keep those fingers to the keyboard and pen to the page in order to be able to move that forward. Yes, and I love that. Yes, thank you in the chat. Marking the impulse for later exploration is really good tip. Yes, I like that. Yeah, because you mark the impulse, you know that you need to go find something, but just keep moving. Yep, yep. So thank you for reiterating and shouting out and kind of fine tuning that. The no using the delete button. This is probably the most controversial element of drafting and in the Patricia Goodson mode of just keeping it moving forward. If you're in a generative session, I would recommend not using the delete button, but it may also slow you down. It may not be that you're typing so quickly, right, that you make mistakes and then you have to go delete. May just slow you down a little bit so that you're much more measured, and you might actually find a really good pace for you to generate at. So that's one of the benefits of using the no delete button. The other benefit is that you keep your production of words moving forward. So again, even if you're writing things like, I didn't know what I was going to say right here, but I think what I really want to be writing about is, and you're typing that in, you know that you will go back and you will delete that, not in that moment, because that, think about the energy and the movement, right? You're moving in one direction and then you're going back and you're taking something out and then you're trying to fill it in again. And I think mentally and emotionally, that's just hard. And it doesn't feel like you're making a lot of progress. So by not using the delete button, by leaving your musing and your ponderings and your misspelled words and your incorrect things, and you can put things in parentheses. I've now gotten to be really fast at like parentheses, brackets, right, around words. Like, I know this is not the right word, but bracket it and then keep moving, because it cues me later when I'm doing my editing to go back and go, oh yeah, that's not the word I want, but this is the one that I do. For those of you who are non-native English writers, where English may be your second, third, or fourth onward language, that can be really helpful, so that you kind of bracket off, and or you could even put in words that are, if you are a native Spanish writer or Portuguese is your first language, you can just put in whatever the Portuguese term is for that, and then keep moving forward. That way it doesn't stop you, and you don't also have to delete when you're like, oh, I put in the Portuguese word, oh, delete, put in the English word. You don't have to do it. You can just keep moving it forward. Again, no editing. And if you're generating, and if you're having a focus session that's about editing, it's still going to be productive. It just won't be producing as much text sometimes. Oftentimes you'll find at the end of an editing session that you have fewer words in a document than you did before. Always, but often. Adhering to your own kind of workshop timeline or your own session, we should call it session timeline here. This is for the 4-hour article. Excuse me. But if you set the timer, adhere to the timer. It's really easy for us to just kind of bypass them or ignore them. But by doing that, you train your mind to know, I had to be focused during this time. And if you weren't, that's something to mark. If you were focused through the entire time, then give yourself a pat on the back and you're like, yep, I got done what it is that I got done during the session. This is an accomplishment. And take breaks and breaths as you need them. We practice this in all of our writing retreats, where people get up and go and walk around for a few minutes, kind of clear the mind, clear the cobwebs, whatever it is that's there, the kind of fog, and then come back. If there are assigned breaks, if you, let's say, are part of a writing session with colleagues in a writing group, or you're part of the 4-hour article draft, take those assigned breaks with colleagues. It seems antithetical to how it is that you want to operate. Like, let's say you're on a roll and you're like, oh, we scheduled a writing break, but take the break, because you'll have to leave some notes on where you want to pick up again, and then go and be social and come back. It does a world of makes a world of difference, I think, for who you feel you are as a writer and your writing experience. Sorry, I have something in my throat. Let me see if I can clear it. All right, writing for speed. I don't know if that made any difference. Something stuck. But that writing for speed, during those sessions, you want to practice non-judging kind of writing generation, right? You just want to not judge yourself, just writing. Oh, it's stuck. There we go. Practice mindful awareness, body and breath, really helpful. Adding bibliography, citations, footnotes, post, workshop or post session, really, really helpful. Because if you, again, go down that rabbit hole of like, what was that citation? That one guy wrote that one thing that one time that seemed to be useful here. You just bracket it off. Just say, I know citation with so-and-so, right? And then keep moving forward. Bibliography, citations, those can be other writing sessions, perhaps. But it's still also focused, but it would be different types of tasks. And you'll notice that what this is reminding you to do is to batch or kind of chunk the types of tasks that you're working on. Because also by flipping back and forth, I'm going to be writing a little bit, and then I'm going to be going to my citations and bibliography, and then I'm going to be going to the database and then back and forth. You can leave a writing session so exhausted with all of that movement. So batching it, knowing, I'm going to focus here, maybe I'm going to only write for 15, 20 minutes, and then I'm going to go, and I'm going to go back to the databases. So maybe it's a conscious decision that you're doing. Yeah. And then celebrate anything that you generate, right? At the end of a session needs to be, a high five for yourself. And I'm genuine in saying that you need to acknowledge what it is that you've accomplished, even if what you accomplished is less than you had wanted, different than you wanted, acknowledge, or that you just sat there and you kind of stared at the screen blankly for your 20-minute writing session. If that's all you did, it's still an accomplishment. Jolie Jensen talks about how you showed up at least. She also talks about ventilating, by the way. So if you ever get stuck, you can just vent and be like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know what I was supposed to be writing, but I'm here for my writing session. That's still an accomplishment. All right. And express that gratitude. A couple more things before we open it up for conversation. Emma Darwin, she recommends that you write that first draft for yourself to work out what you think, and the second draft for your reader. So again, if you're getting caught up in like, I think this needs to be perfect, or I think this needs to be better than what it is right now and what you're generating, if it's that first draft, know that you're going to come back and you're going to clean it up, and you're going to think about what the reader needs and what it is that they need to hear from you, right? What you're trying to say. So writing at speed, ultimately, it takes some strategies, and I think it takes regular practice. If you if these strategies are appealing to you and you know that you've not done them, start slowly, just regularly kind of build it in so that you're doing that 5 by 5, right? You could start with the Roosevelt dash, but it might be better to start kind of just regularly building some other things in. What it does is it allows for you to access your generative writing mind and keep that separate, recognizing the value of your critical mind for going through and editing. So if you have that internal critic that shifts inward towards you, away from the text and what it is that you're writing, really helpful to just like see the difference between those two. You have a generative lens, a creative lens, and a critical lens that are geared towards language and production. And when you're trying to use both of them again at the same time, they can get bunged up. But being able to separate them out and keep them focused on the text and the language can just be really helpful. And it can keep you from then being your own worst enemy with your inner critic. Talk back to that critical kind of editor's mind that turns towards you. And I think what might happen is by doing this, you might experience that it slows things down for you just a little bit. And that's okay, because you're focusing on the techniques and the steps rather than perhaps just jumping in. But I think you may feel a little bit more like being the tortoise rather than the hare, but I think you will speed up much more quickly after. Sprint and Write Tuesdays, I mentioned these, and they're connected to the 4-hour article method. These will start in September. So I think it's September 17th. We'll have it posted. It's not quite yet on the website, but if you go to the Show Up and Write webpage on the CSU Writes website, this is something that Kimmy and I are working on building out. We'll have the Show Up and Write sessions. Those will start, they'll have in-person options, and then there will be virtual options, and then we'll have the sprint options. And those are Tuesday mornings at 9 to 11. They're in the Walnut building. I'll be leading those. So I'll be the person with the timer telling you when to start writing and when to stop writing. So just so you know that there are proctors, there are lead writers, people who show up and host these sessions. If you're interested in hosting a session, if you want some additional accountability, we are now setting up our show up and write for the semester. And what that would mean is that you would sign up for a session or two. You could do, like, let's say you want to write at Monday. You know that you want to just show up on Mondays from 8 to 10 or Wednesdays from 8 to 10. You can do both. And then we sign you up for those times and spaces, and you can do it virtually or you can do it in person. And then you just wait for other writers to come in and write with you. There's no additional sign up for folks. But once you get used to who the people are, you find that you share ideas and stories, and you set your goals and you say, this is what I accomplished in this session. And they wind up being really lovely sessions to be able to keep your work moving forward. And if you show up for 20 sessions, you're in CSU Write swag. And the swag has changed over the years. Ultimately, my parting wish for you is, until we meet again, may your writing be brief, frequent, low stress, and highly rewarding. This is comes from Jolie Jensen, but I stole it many, many years ago, and it's our tagline, and it's on our swag, some of our swag. So really, it's what you want to have is brief sessions and frequent sessions, and so that they're low stress and that you feel good about them. All right, reach out if you want to talk, or if you know that you want to host a show up and write session. Love to hear from you. And I'm going to open it up for